Hey guys, welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. I'm Arcran, and today we're talking about spellcasting, and more specifically spell components. Before we get into the running with class videos for druids and wizards and warlocks, I want to make sure that we've covered the basics of spellcasting because all of those classes more or less have to follow the same rules when they cast spells. We're starting with spell components for two reasons. The first being that it interacts with every single spell. Every spell uses spell components, which means every spellcaster has to worry about spell components. The other reason is that the rules are written in a very plain English way, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and it's important to make sure that your players' expectations and your expectations match on how spell components work, as well as how you'll be enforcing them in your campaign. As a quick overview before we dive into these with more detail, there are three spell components: verbal, somatic, and material. The verbal component is the arcane chanting that your character uses when casting a spell. The somatic component are the hand gestures and arcane movements they use when casting a spell, and the material component is a focus or some type of item that they use to focus the spell's power and assist in its casting. That brief overview is really about all we have from the actual book for spell components. Xanathar's Guide to Everything did add that if a spell has components, it's noticeable when it's cast, but it doesn't really tell us from how far away or how noticeable. It just says it's noticeable, which is helpful as a DM, but not what we really need, and that's what we're going to get to when we do our deep dives into each of the different components. First up is verbal. The verbal component of a spell is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's something that the spellcaster is saying as a part of casting the spell. It can be a chant, some kind of arcane invocation. It can just be Wingardium Leviosa. Something fun to note here is that the actual words being said don't matter for the verbal component. Instead, the intonation and the sounds being made are what matter. This means that you can have a lot of creative leeway in what it sounds like when your spellcaster casts a spell. It can be deep Latin chanting, whimsical Disney rhymes, or even just vaguely magic sounding words. They're all perfectly fine in terms of the verbal component, and it's a great way for your players and NPCs to set themselves apart and give their spellcasting a little bit more flavor. Now, mechanically, the verbal component is pretty simple. If your character can't speak for whatever reason, whether they be in a zone of silence or they're gagged, they can't cast spells with verbal components. It's a really simple one to handle in terms of that. The problem arises with how obvious is the verbal component of a spell, and this is something where the rules are frustratingly vague. The player's handbook tells us that it requires mystic chanting, which implies some level of obviousness, but isn't super clear, and Xanathar's Guide to Everything tells us that a spell with any component, verbal, somatic, or material, is perceptible, but it doesn't really give us any thresholds for how perceptive an NPC has to be to notice that spell casting. Because of that, we're going to be getting into a little bit of my own interpretation of the rules as opposed to what's actually written in the book, because there's not a whole lot there. I follow two rules for the verbal components of spells. One, it requires speaking a bit louder than a normal speaking voice. Definitely not yelling, but it's noticeably louder than you would use in a normal conversation. And two, it's obviously odd. No matter what you're saying, the sounds and the pitches you have to hit aren't normal conversation. Now, if you follow a similar interpretation to mine, there's two main things you're going to want to keep in mind for the verbal components of spells. The first is that casting a spell with a verbal component in a conversation is going to be tricky. Even a character that doesn't know anything about magic is going to be a little bit confused and definitely notice if mid-conversation you raise your voice and start speaking oddly. Anyone with more than a passing familiarity with magic will definitely know what you just tried to do and will react accordingly. Peasants might cower in fear at the chance of witchcraft, and guards might get a bit more aggressive because you just tried to do something and they're not sure what. If a character wants to cast a spell with a verbal component in a situation where they can be clearly heard, they're going to need some sort of loud distraction that they can time their spellcasting in to mask the sounds of it. The other thing to keep in mind is that if a character is trying to cast a spell with a verbal component while trying to be sneaky or stealthy, they're going to need to put a lot of distance between them and anyone that could hear, because they can't whisper the spell. They have to say it at that volume, otherwise it doesn't work. Now, you can probably get away with just telling your spellcasters you're far away enough or you're not far away enough. They know about how loud their spell is, so they probably can have a good idea of how far away they need to be, But if you want something a little bit more mechanical, I would do a base perception check DC of 5 plus 2 for every 10 feet away the spellcaster is from the listener. As a practical example of this, let's say a wizard is trying to sneak by a guard and wants to cast invisibility to make it a little bit easier. Invisibility has a verbal component, so they have to say something, and a guard has a passive perception of 12. So if the DC to hear our spellcasting is less than 12, the guard's going to automatically notice. If you are 0 feet away from the guard, casting it right next to him, he definitely notices. 12 is way more than 5, so they got you. But as you get further and further away, that DC goes up, and once you hit 40 feet, 4 times 2 is 8, plus 5 is 13. 13 is more than 12, that exceeds the guard's passive perception, and the wizard can safely cast the spell there. Feel free to tweak this depending on the circumstances. Maybe if your player is behind a sturdy wall and not a lot of sound would go through that, the DC starts at 15 instead of 5. Or maybe if they're in a cavern that echoes really badly and sound travels, the DC ramps up by +1 per 10 feet instead of +2, which means they can be heard from further away. The last point I want to make is that if a spell has a verbal component, no matter what the description says, it requires that arcane chanting. Even spells like Suggestion that say you say something as a part of casting the spell, you still have to do the arcane chanting, the mystic words first. And that does make them obvious, and it does make them a little bit trickier to use. As a DM, I recommend that you shamelessly steal from The Witcher and kind of do what they do there, where if there's multiple creatures and you cast a spell, they notice. If you're one-on-one with the creature and you cast some type of charm spell or something, if it succeeds, they ignore that you just cast that spell. But if the spell fails because they made their saving throw or they're immune, they know you just tried to do something to them and they don't like it. And with that, we're done with verbal components, and don't worry, the next two are much easier, I promise. Somatic components are the hand gestures and the waving of arms that you have to do as a part of casting a spell. The only requirement here is that you need to have one arm free, which mechanically means you need just a hand that's not doing something else. You can't be dual wielding swords and cast a spell with a somatic component. There is an exception to this rule, but we're going to wait till we get to material components to cover it because it has to do with spellcasting focuses, which are a core part of material components. The only other time that a character would not be able to cast spells with a somatic component is if their hands are restricted somehow. Either they're handcuffed, they're bound together. It's entirely up to you as the DM for what free use of one hand means. I personally rule that simply being handcuffed is enough to block spellcasting because you can't do the full range of motions that you normally would, but you may rule differently, and this is something you should establish ahead of time just so your players know what to expect. In terms of detecting somebody casting a spell with somatic components, it's specific arcane gestures, and it's kind of in the same book as verbal, where it looks weird enough that even someone that doesn't know anything about spellcasting is going to know something's up. Fortunately, this is much easier to get around than a verbal component. You just need to make sure that the character can't see you, whether if their back is turned due to a distraction, or if you're just hidden. A spell with somatic component is completely undetectable, as long as they can't see you. And with that, we're done with somatic components, and we're going to move on to material components, which are pretty simple, but probably the most misunderstood of the three spellcasting components. The material component of a spell is some type of object that's required to cast it. And if you look in the spell's components, if it has a material component, it's going to be listed right next to that M. And they're usually a little bit tongue-in-cheek and make sense for the spell they're attached to. Like molasses is required for the spell slow, because slow makes things as slow as molasses. In most cases, you can ignore the items required by these spells. Unless the material component has a listed cost, it can be replaced by either a component pouch or a focus. A component pouch is kind of a way to abstract out these items. In terms of flavor, you're still casting spells using snakes' tongues and molasses. You just keep a small pouch that you keep stocked up with all the items you need for spellcasting. You don't have to worry about replenishing it or items running out. It's just a way to take a step back and abstract out all of those small items. The other option, a focus, functions similarly, where any material component that does not have a listed cost is just replaced by the focus. And every class has their own types of focus. Wizards use wands and staves, whereas clerics use holy symbols and shields emblazoned with their god's emblem. Because component pouches and spellcasting focuses exist, you should never really have to make your players worry about spellcasting components that don't have a listed cost. These items are assumed to fall under either a focus or component pouch, and really the only time your wizard should have to worry about finding bat guano is if you're in some kind of scenario where the party has lost all their gear and has to try to scrounge supplies to survive. Any scenario outside of that, as long as they have their focus or component pouch, they are good to go. The exception to all this are spells that require an item with a specific cost. This item has to be provided, otherwise the spell just doesn't work and can't be cast. Some spells, like Identify, require an item, but they don't use it up. They can be used over and over again, and that same 100 gold pearl that you have for Identify can be used over and over again. Other spells, like Revivify, specifically consume the items used in their casting, and those items are gone. Nobody knows where they go, but you don't have that item anymore, and if you want to cast Revivify again, you better go get some more diamonds. Tend to lean if the character has that item in hand, they can just cast that spell with the material component, and that's as obvious as it is. They just need to have their staff, their wand, whatever. The somatic and the verbal components are the flashy parts, the material component just needs to be there. In terms of our mechanical concerns here, the material component follows almost the exact same rules as the somatic component. You need a free hand to use whatever the material component is, and as long as you have that, you can cast the spell. The thing to note here is that if a spell has somatic and material components, you can use the same hand for both. This means that for a spell with a somatic and material component, the hand holding your focus is the same hand that you can use for your somatic component. Now, there is one weird edge case that I'm just going to tell you to ignore, and that's that if you have a spell that has a somatic component but no material component, suddenly that hand holding a focus can't perform the somatic component anymore. It's a little bit obtuse, and honestly it doesn't make much sense, so I just suggest you ignore it, and any hand holding a focus can be used for both the material and somatic components of a spell, regardless of the case. I want to cover exactly how having a free hand works for all the different classes really quickly, just because that's probably the biggest hiccup. For most spellcasters, this isn't going to be a huge burden. Anyone that holds a focus in one hand is set, and for clerics and paladins who might want to use a shield and weapon, that shield actually can count as their focus because they can just slap a big painting of their god's symbol on it and it's a focus for them. It's right there in the book. The only situations where you're really going to run into a problem are when characters that are not clerics or paladins want to have a weapon and shield or a weapon in either hand. In these scenarios, you're going to want to talk to your players and make sure they understand the limitations of what they've chosen, and maybe work with them to see how you can make their vision work. For a sword and shield character, they can take the Warcaster feat, which will let them perform the somatic components of a spell with their shield hand, but they're still kind of out of luck on material components and might need to pick up spells that avoid material components specifically because of that. A character that wields two swords is going to have a really hard time because they need both hands with them, and unless they have a way to make their weapons count as a focus, they're really going to struggle to cast any spell that is not just a verbal component. If you have a character in your party that wants to be a spellcaster and also use a sword and shield or two swords, I suggest you look at the item, the Ruby of the War Mage, and make sure that falls into their lap at some point. It lets them use a weapon as a spellcasting focus, which will solve all of their woes. Or, if you want to be a little bit more fun, make a magic weapon that also counts as a focus that can be a cool piece of loot for them in the future. And with that, you should know the ins and outs of all three spell components, as well as how you can arbitrate them in your game in a way that makes sense, and is hopefully also fun for your players. A lot of DMs just ignore spell components, and I feel like that's a mistake. It adds a level of parity between the skilled characters and the spellcasters, and by limiting when spells can be used outside of combat in terms of just how noticeable they are, you give the characters without access to spells a chance to shine and really show their worth. I'm also of the opinion that you shouldn't let deception checks or sleight of hand checks hide the verbal or somatic components of a spell. They're obvious, and letting characters just use skills for this cheapens the use of abilities like Subtle Spell and things like that, and it also kind of steps on the toes of characters that just have to talk with their deception checks to try to get something done. And that's it. hopefully this video has cleared up any questions you might have had about spell components and given you some good ideas to use in the future. If you have any questions about spellcasting components or suggestions for a future video, please leave a comment. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum and have a great day!